Welcome, friend. Here we go. Today, we're going to continue our little series about chords, but we're going to do more of a head trip. This came from a couple of questions. One was, what's the benefit of knowing the notes on your fretboard? It came from a young adult. I think it's kind of obvious, but of course, you get a lot of information coming at you from a lot of sources very fast, and everyone can go on YouTube and look at videos like this one or whatever. And so some people might not see the value of knowing the notes on your fretboard or studying music theory to begin with at all. But that question and the question about, chords, how they're made up, and what is voice leading, a lot of questions that are interrelated, and, I'm going to try and answer a couple of them here. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll get an understanding of what you need to know in order to understand chords, and what you need to know in order to manipulate chords and understand a beginning process of how you can do something called voice leading, which is it's just a way of manipulating the notes as they change between chords. So the first thing is we want to know what a chord is, but before we do that, we also want to know how the shape of Western music is in general. And the easiest way to describe that is to look at a piano. And I'm not going to reach for lots of bits of paper like I do sometimes. I'm just going to post it up onto the video itself. So the first thing you want to know is what a natural half step is. And a natural half step, there's two places where this happens on a piano. If you look, you'll see that there's two white keys with no black key in between them. Now that's a semitone or a half step. That's pretty much the measurement for frequency in the modern world, is that we go by the distance of one pitch to another, of one key to another key, regardless of the color of the key to the next door key. So it could be a black key to a white key. In the case of the natural semitone or natural half steps, it's a white key to a white key. I'm using the word natural because that's the word that applies to the white keys of a piano. They're called the natural notes. The black keys are the sharps and the flats. So that's the ones that are the shorter black ones that are, except for E and F and B and C, they're not in between, but they're in between all the rest of them. So E's and F's and B's and C's is what we're talking about. Now, if you look at your guitar, hopefully you know the names of your strings. That's one of the things that's kind of a must, really, to be able to communicate with people and to get learning stuff. So you got two E strings and you got this B string. So E to F is the nut, the open string to the first fret. That's an E to an F. And B to C is the B string to the first fret, which is the note C. It's following the musical alphabet, which is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and starts again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Those 7 letters. There's no H. Doesn't go any further than that. So if you look at that, you'll see then that these 3 strings, the 2 E's and the B, have the next note, the next letter next to them. The E's to the F's and the B to the C. The last 3, the other 3 that are left, you have to skip a fret. An A to a B, a D to an E, and a G. There's no H, so back to A. So that's the first thing. Those are called natural half steps, and that's how you can find every note on your fretboard if you understand that. You can go right up the string, E to an F. All you got to remember is everything skips except for E and F and B and C. And that's all you got to remember. You can put it B and C and E and F, doesn't matter the order. It's like a movie theater where, a cinema where it's not very full and people don't know each other. They won't sit next to a stranger if there's lots of open seats, right? So all you got to think is like E and F know each other. It's like, hey, E, F, how you doing, buddy? Yeah, F, nice to see you. E, C. And then down the other row there's B and C. B, hey, B, C, how you doing? B, A, B, C, yeah, all right. They chat and they sit next to each other. E and F, B and C, right? The rest of them skip. A to B, D to E, G back to A. Right, so that's the natural half steps covered. The other thing you got to know is if you can spell the word face, F-A-C-E, and try to remember these 3 letters, G, B, D, then you know all the chords in the universe, because that's what they are. F-A-C-E is every other letter of the alphabet if you start on F. It's just a coincidence that's how it works, and it lines up in our musical stave nice and proper with lines and spaces and all that. So if you think about it, an F, skip the G, to an A, skip the B, to a C, skip the D, to an E, skip the F, get to G, skip the A, get to B, skip the C, get to D. Face G, B, D. So what you want to do for this is in your mind's eye, you just want to go at a tempo and think F, A, C, E, G, B, D, F, A, C, E, G, B, D, to the point where if I'm tapping along like this and I say a D, you go D, F, A, C. If I said C, you go E, then G. If I said B, you go D, then F. So I said B, you go D, then F. What I said that already. But you see what I mean? That it's not just face G, B, D. It's every other letter, and it just goes round and round. An A and a C and an E, a C and an E and a G, an E and a G and a B, and a G and a B and a D and a D and an F and an A and an F and an A and C, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. If you know those two things, like I always say to people, if you can count to 12 and say the alphabet from A to G, then I call this sort of bass-ackward theory, where you're learning the mnemonics first and then applying them. But that's all right, whatever works for you. Some people like to go from the ground up and learn the theory as you go, and some people just say, well, give me the mnemonics, give me the shortcuts, There's nothing wrong with this if it gets working for you. So those are the two big theoretical things, Now you can realize how to find the notes on your fretboard. And now you realize why, because E's and F's and B's and C's are next to each other and everybody else skips. Chords are nothing but every other letter. Now there's a third thing, but you don't really have to know that because I'm going to supply like a cheat sheet for you on that. But if you think about what, say, an A minor chord is, I'm hoping that all you guys that are looking at this have the CAGED chords, C, A, G, E, D major. And then you can usually get the A minor and the E minor and the D minor out of that. So you get these 8 chords, which gives you a bazillion song worth of chords, But if you think, what's the A minor? That's an A and a C and an E. And if you look closely, well, I've got an E here. That's my E string. You tick off the E. I got an A. That's my A string. I tick that one off. I got this note here. That's the 2nd fret of the D. Well, what's that? Well, that's the D string. That's not E, of course. That's the 2nd note along in the alphabet from it. That's the E, because it has to skip. That's the black key that's in between where I'm poking my finger here. So then you got the next note here. What's that? Oh, that's that 2nd fret A again. What's this note? The B and the C that's next to it. What's this note? It's the E again. So now I've got my A, my C, and my E. Only now there's 2 A's appearing. The A string and the G string one. And the D string is the E, and the E string up here. And this low E, which quite often we don't always hit when we're using that, strumming that chord, unless we're doing something. Where we're messing and doing stuff like that. But usually strumming, it's nice to have the root on the bottom. So again, the word root. A chord, A is the root. Minor, that's just something we'll talk about later, but it's every other letter, A's, C's, and E's. Now if I make it A major, I still got A's, C's, and E's, but the A happens to be sharp. Yeah? So that's what's happening. You got to plug in sharps and flats. But like I said, I'll plug those in for you when I edit this video. And all you got to really be thinking about is what the semitones are, how you find notes, and then what you want to do is an exercise, a practical exercise. It's not the most exciting thing in the world. It's not the most exciting exercise I've ever designed. But you just want to look at every chord you know, or the chords that you're working with for something, and say, well, what was that fool talking about? What is it? E's, G's, B? How can that be? And do what we did, and just say, if this is an E chord, say to yourself, well, okay, that's an E, that's an E. Oh, I get it, that's an E. That's 50% of the thing gone right there. An E and an E, and I get it, that's an E. So E's, F, G's the next thing. Well, I got a G string. Okay, so that's something. It's not a G anymore. Well, that's not a G, that's not a G. Wait a minute, I get it, it's G sharp. G to G sharp. The black keys are labeled as sharp or flat. I should have told you that. But again, I'll put a graphic up so you can see how this works. So then you got your E's, your G, and then these two you'll discover are B's. The A to the B and the B string. And you want to take whatever chords you're working with, or just take them one at a time, going through the CAGED system, and try to work out. Basically, you're working out what the notes are down here in the open position, it's called, because you're really operating off the open strings. And then you're trying to figure out those notes. Now, it seems a bit tedious, but after a while you'll get really used to it. You think a C chord. Why is that a C? A, B, B, and C. Oh, of course, that's a C. Of course it is. Oh, why is that? Oh, cool. Oh, 2 C's. Of course it is. Later, if you learn the A string really well, you'll know the B string. Because if you know the A string, whatever it is in that shape, an octave away, that's a C, that's a C. If that's a D, that's a D. If that's an E, that's an E, It's one of 2 plus 2 rules, but now it's just whatever, the C shape rule. So you're learning the notes by doing that. Now, why am I trying to get you to do this? Because if I gave you a chord progression of chords you know, some that you might be really familiar with, like you can really jam them across, jumping from chord to chord, but you want to do something more interesting with them. Let's say I give you a chord progression like an E to a D to a G. So I'm going E to D to G to E. Maybe I'll chuck in an A. Okay, it just sounds like 4 chords, you know what I mean? But what if I said, well, let's look at it closely and see. We're going from an E to a D. Well, what's a D? It's D's, and you realize the F is sharp. It's D's, F's, and A's, but the F is sharp. So why don't I just take that F sharp and move it to the bottom? I can keep the whole chord like that. Like that. I quite often just think, well, just forget the high F now, and just move it to the bottom. Now what I've got already is an E chord going to a G. Yeah, so I got this. E, D over F sharp, leading to F sharp leading to G. And then I chucked in an E again. But why go back to that E when I think that's got like a G sharp in it, right? And I'm on a G. So now I'm going to go like this. Now I'm going to get this. Oh, that looks complicated. Well, think about it. If I've got this E chord here like this, and I realize that I've got a G way out there, and I don't want my pinky ripping itself off my hand like that, I can just say, well, I'll just put another finger there instead and bar this. But then I've got this note, which could sound nice, you know. Whoops. Could end up do something with that, but it doesn't really work so well with the G sharp, you know. And it's not part of it's not E, G, or B. It's not really part of the E chord. So, well, I'm stuffed now, aren't I? But an A to a B is a whole step or a whole tone. So that's the tuning note for our B string, if you've ever done that before, the 4th fret. So now I've got this. A nice way of playing an E chord over G sharp. So now I got this. To an A. And that's partly why I added that A, because it's going to do this now. Oops. What I've really done now is I've gone back to my D chord. Hey, presto. But all I've done now is I moved the F sharp, not to the bottom, but to the middle. Just like this is E's, F's, sharps. D chord, F sharp, in the middle. Now instead of using my pinky, I was on an A chord. There's an A and a D chord as well, by the way. You hear that? So now I can just say, well, I just bar that like an A, and then I'm going to put the F sharp where it belongs. And if you look at this little bar here, you'll see that really it's nothing more than what my 3 fingertips were doing. But now I can put an F in the middle. So by knowing the names of the notes, knowing how to construct a chord out of every other letter of the alphabet, by understanding how to find the notes, by just thinking E and F are next to each other, B and C are next to each other, the rest aren't, everything in between is a sharp or flat, and all the flats, every note, white keys included, has more than one name. It's called enharmonic equivalent, not end, not END, just enharmonic. It just means that they, I don't know, well, the proper definition, but it means they both share a name. So the C sharp could have been D flat that I played with A major earlier. The F sharp could have been G flat. But, you know, they end up with their sort of names that gets used more often because of a thing called key signature, but we'll talk about that separately. This is just kind of a leaping over a few paving stones on the path, you know? This is just kind of a way of short-circuiting a bit of theory, so that all you really got to know is a couple of concepts. How to find the notes on your fretboard, the natural half steps, and that chords are nothing more than every other letter. And so when you look at them, you can work out what they are. And then if you think, I'm going from an E to an F, E to a D rather, I can think about, well, I could play that D with that F on the bottom. Some people use their thumb, you know. I'm trying to voice lead the closest note to the closest note to the closest note, because that's what human ears like a lot of. So that's the idea that, you know, I'm going nowhere with this as far as like a song. So, well, actually, this little chunk I just did a minute ago, the A to the D this way. Think about this little arrangement, an A to a D. What if I did this? Right? Everyone's heard that kind of riff. But to me, that's like a you know, one of those old movies with some primary school teaching, singing to a bunch of kids at a campfire going, la, 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 you know? Whereas if you put this F in the middle, instead of going, this is a G, E, F sharp, G, right? That's pretty, that's nice, but if I put this in the middle, the G here, much hipper, much cooler, right? So, whoops, becomes, I like putting the G on the D as well. So, voice leading, it's about knowing how to find the notes, the names of the notes of your chords, and knowing as well the component analysis of it, you know, like this D, this is the root of a D chord. This E, doesn't matter where the E is, these E's are the roots of that E chord. This A and this A are the roots of that A chord. If you put a root up here and another E up here, that's just what's called a power chord when you leave out the middle note. But anyway, that's the idea, that you're taking what you already know and you can expand that by understanding what you already know. Understanding that, you know, this A that I played with one finger is still an A if I use, you know, whatever fingers I want, barred or not. And it's major because of this chord, this note rather, I'm sorry. It's like going do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3, rather than the minor, which is do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3. People consider to be the sad one, the happier one, you know? And so that's the principle, and you can rewind this video, look at it again. I'll put it on a, you know, in graphic form. But an E to D over F sharp, to any kind of G that you want to grab, to an E chord barred these two strings with one finger, the G sharp and the B. I quite often don't bother with anything else. If I can get the B to ring, that's cool. But you can. You know, but if you don't want, if it's a pain to make that ring, just let it go dead. It's still a cool movable form, an A chord. So you can get cool sounds just by understanding how you can rearrange a few things. Right. I was going to make this really short, but I don't think it is. But hopefully, wherever you are, all you need to be able to do is play these open chords, open your mind a bit to what they're made of and how we're doing this, and then you'll have it, you know? And I hope that's of use to you. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.